Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revealing Israel would immediately resume negotiations for the release of all hostages held in Gaza, but only on terms acceptable to Israel. The Israeli Defense Minister, Katz, has just sent out a notice in Hebrew warning Hamas, quote, "The gates of hell will open if this terror group does not agree to a ceasefire, bring an end to nearly 2 years of fighting." He also said they now have approved the IDF's plans to defeat Hamas in Gaza, overwhelming firepower, evacuation of residents, and maneuver operations. I want to bring in UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer. Hillel, I want to get your reaction to this because we knew this was coming. The cabinet had already approved for the complete takeover of Gaza, Gaza City. But it looks like we may see some pretty major operations underway within the next 24 to 48 hours in Gaza.
That's right. Look, folks have to remember that Israel is sitting next door to a terrorist organization that is armed and financed by the Islamic regime in Iran, that is holding dozens of hostages, some living, some dead, and has sworn to repeat the assault that they perpetrated on October 7th, 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago, where they massacred more than 1,000 people, families, and committed atrocities. And they threaten to do it again. They still fire rockets at Israel when they can. So Israel has an obligation to push back. There's a stronghold in Gaza City. Of course, there's a dilemma. In Israel, there's a terrible dilemma. Do you defeat Hamas and root them out as you need to do, but at the same time, you have to do everything not to harm the hostages? And that's why Israel's prime minister announced that he was going to instruct his negotiators to engage fully diplomatically to seek to negotiate the release of the hostages.
But Hamas has been completely unwilling for all these years to negotiate. And I mean, there were releases, but at this point, those last living hostages seem to be the only bargaining chip that Hamas has left. Do you think they're even going to use that chip at all? Or do you think that it is a worst case scenario where, unfortunately, if the IDF gets close enough to where the hostages are, that Hamas would indeed kill them?
Well, tragically, that is what happened last year, and many people in Israel painfully remember when some of the hostages were executed exactly as you said, as Israel got closer. So look, this is a vicious terrorist organization. They're not new at this modus operandi. Let's recall 25 years ago, Hamas unleashed suicide bombers, which were blowing up dozens and dozens of suicide bombs in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in pizza shops, in discotheques and so forth. So blowing up buses. This is a nihilistic death cult. They are holding on to hostages in part to torture them, but also to create a rift between Israelis, because a large part of Israelis say do everything to release the hostages, and others say yes, but we also have to defeat Hamas. So it's a horrible dilemma, and one wouldn't want to be any of Israel's cabinet ministers having to make that decision.
Well, Israel is accusing the United Nations of misleading the world as aid to Gaza is being stolen and diverted from civilians. It seems that Hamas has been doing this for months. A review conducted by the Israeli Coordinator of Government Activities is claiming that UN figures have failed to account for the entry of about 6,000 additional aid trucks since May. They write the fact that the UN presents only part of the aid actually misleads the international community and creates a false picture of the situation, directly influencing global media coverage and shaping the positions of international decision makers regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Hillel, your reaction to that statement?
Well, it's tragic. You know, the UN is meant to be the world's primary humanitarian organization, and yet we've seen in the past 2 years, in this case and others, that systematically they have mobilized to parrot the narrative that is pushed out by Hamas. Whatever is the Hamas narrative, you will see it days later endorsed by UN agencies, and that goes into the media ecosystem as quoted by the UN. The UN said, so indeed, as you said, the UN is saying only a few thousand trucks, 3,000 trucks have entered Gaza since May. The reality, it's 9,000 trucks. They failed to count 6,000 because they weren't brought in by the UN. Well, guess what? The US and Israel have been backing the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an alternative to the UN, which is now giving up to 2 million meals a day. And the UN sees that as a threat, especially their agency, UNRWA, which is complicit with Hamas. The heads of UNRWA in Gaza and Lebanon and other places are actual Hamas members. So they are mobilized in a way that is failing to uphold the UN's humanitarian principles.
But it's so interesting because if you listen to the UN, that they'll say, well, we're the ones that should be handling the aid. We're the experts. We're the people that know how to do this. That's their pushback. Does that ring hollow to you?
Well, it does because, especially with UNRWA, that's the primary agency in Gaza. It's meant to be the UN agency for Palestinians. They employ 13,000 staff. The UN will say only UNRWA can distribute food. Well, why is that? Israel says, and there's strong evidence, that there are thousands of members of UNRWA staff who belong to Hamas. When Hamas took over Gaza, they infiltrated the entire UNRWA. We have a report, UN Watch, next month showing that teachers, school principals, heads of the unions overseeing thousands of UNRWA staff are leading Hamas terror chiefs. And UNRWA says, the UN says, only we can give out aid. So what you have is actually they are disguising a pathological agenda because UNRWA tells Palestinians that their mission is to dismantle Israel. And they wrap that as a humanitarian agency. And when any other group, like the US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is giving out 2 million meals, they see that as an existential threat.
Before you go, I want to ask you about this story. This senior World Bank group economist is lobbing accusations at political leaders for their stance on Israel yesterday. During an Italian parliament forum, the economist publicly accused Italy of supporting genocide against Palestinians. The UN Watch is now calling on the World Bank group to fire him because of these anti-Semitic statements. I know you've been following that story. What can you tell us?
Look, yesterday our organization, UN Watch, sent a letter to the president of the World Bank demanding that they terminate a senior economist of theirs named Massimiliano Calli. He happens to be the husband of Francesca Albanese, who is a known pro-Hamas UN figure who was sanctioned last month by the United States. And she's barred entry into the U.S. And he, in his own part, has been working for over a decade for the World Bank. At the same time, on his Facebook page, he calls for the indictment of Netanyahu. He accuses him of massacres. He endorses a pro-Hamas initiative. He compares Israelis to Nazis. And as you said, he recently stood up in the Italian parliament while his wife was accusing Israel of genocide. He parroted her remarks. He called on the EU to break their trade pact with Israel. All of this is in gross violation of the World Bank's basic rules. We wrote to Secretary Rubio yesterday and said, look, America is a top donor to the World Bank. If you have their officials embracing a Hamas narrative, acting in a way that is completely contrary to what an international civil servant, how he's supposed to behave, that person should be fired.
Hillel Neuer, thank you so much for the perspective. We're obviously going to be following any breaking news developments out of Israel and Gaza over the next couple of days as things seem to be really moving now. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you.